What's up, everybody? I wanted to make a video. Hopefully I can make this quick. It's kind of hard for me to get all my words out in a short amount of time. I don't really do much planning for these videos at all. I actually did kind of plan out my thoughts for this one, and I took some notes, but I left them at home. I'm not at home right now. So I'll just go off my dome and hope for the best. What I wanted to talk about was kind of the broad perspective of this Coltrane Circle of Fifths stuff. What is the underlying philosophical and political ideas that undergird Coltrane and McCoy's and generally 60s jazz musicians move towards, or I should say move away from thirds-based music and move away from a sort of Western-influenced harmonic concept towards a more fifth-based, more open kind of harmonic concept. And my argument is that this was broadly kind of an anti-colonial move, or at least one could say it was a move rooted in liberatory political and philosophical thinking. I use the word anti-colonial for a certain reason, but I think that there's other terms that could be used. I think it's maybe more accurate to say it was broadly rooted in liberatory political thought. But I also think anti-colonial, and I'll try to make a case for that. The reason I'm making this video, I did want to make this video in general, even before I started making the Circle of Fifths stuff. I started writing my thoughts down on this. I feel pretty strongly about this. But I made this, the first video I made, Circle of Fifths Part 1, it was like 95% me talking about music, just the nuts and bolts of music. And then there's like 2 minutes where I talk about how I think that Coltrane's shedding of the influence of the third was broadly was a move influenced by anti-colonial thinking, rooted in like black liberation. And I didn't even say black liberation, but I do think that. But it's funny, all I did was mention that because I think, to me, that kind of is just really obvious. Like, if anyone knows anything about Train and sort of his philosophical and spiritual and political development, you would know that he was very interested in liberation in a lot of different ways. Liberating oneself from all kinds of material forces, racism, colonialism. He was very interested in spirituality. So that could be liberation from, material constraints. He was influenced by Martin Luther King. He was influenced by Malcolm X, which I'll go on to explain, like many musicians were at the time. He grew up in the Jim Crow South. This was a guy that was directly affected by systemic racism and colonialism. And he wasn't bashful about his willingness to approach music, to try to develop new musical theories in order to help liberate humankind. He was not shy about talking about it. He didn't necessarily make it political, though. He didn't necessarily say, like, I'm a black nationalist and I want to do this, like Malcolm X did or something. But he, if you read between the lines, I think it's pretty clear that what he thought about these things. This is someone that was taking influence from Africa, which he considered to be like kind of his motherland, like many black folks did and do, rightfully so. They were brought to the U.S. from Africa as slaves. Their descendants were, there's a lot there. There's a lot to talk about, and I'm kind of already starting to talk about some of it. But to me, it's just obvious. Like, if you watch any of the documentaries about Train or you read anything about his life, it's like Come on, like this is a guy that was interested in liberation. So I got some comments on that video. This is what's so funny is I just mentioned this for like a second. Like I was just like, oh yeah, I think it was kind of broadly a liberatory move on his part to liberate himself from like Western colonial influences. And I got people in the comments being like, oh, that's ridiculous. And oh, like LOL, how could you think that the third is cultural imperialism, which I never actually said. Words are being put in my mouth, etc. It's just clear that if I talk about something for longer than, if I talk about something for as short of a time as like a minute or 2 minutes in a video that's 20 minutes long, and it gets some folks like really revved up and feeling like they need to put words in my mouth and argue with me, and I just said it as an afterthought. If it gets people doing that, that it's striking a chord with someone somewhere. It's pushing some buttons. And so I want to flesh this out a little bit. I've already taken too much time explaining why I'm doing this video, but okay, so let me get into it. So the first thing I wanted to talk about was, what do I mean by music that comes from the colonial world, and what do I mean by colonial, I mean the colonizing, the colonizers. What do I mean by that? What do I mean by thirds-based music? That's what I said. I don't just mean music that uses thirds. All music uses thirds. Thirds come from the overtone series. They're naturally occurring. They're tuned differently when they're naturally occurring, but I can talk about that in a minute. I don't just mean that. I mean a music whose foundational building blocks, beginning in a certain historical period, are the thirds, major thirds, minor thirds, and their inversions, which are major sixths and minor sixths. If you go to music school, which I did, and you take a traditional counterpoint class, Western counterpoint, the whole name of the game is thirds and sixths. That's it. You're supposed to avoid fifths, and you're supposed to avoid octaves, especially when they go in parallel motion. You're not supposed to do that. It's a big no-no. And it's like, I'm not against that. I'm not against constructing a music in thirds. I don't think there's anything right or wrong about constructing a music in thirds, that really necessarily. What I think is wrong is imposing that all over the world without the consent of the natives, and imposing it by violence. That's what I'm opposed to. And by the way, colonialism is not just imposing music. I mean, the roots and the heart of colonialism is the imposition of a new economic mode of production by force on a native people. It's literally the violent subjugation of a sovereign nation by military force, and directly subjugating it politically, and politically controlling and dominating that country to use it for basically the extraction of raw materials or cheap labor or slave labor. That's what colonialism, that's the heart of colonialism. And with that comes the cultural side, where you don't just impose an economic mode of production, you also impose a religion, for example, or a political ideology like liberalism. You impose cultural practices, you impose a new language. Like many indigenous cultures cannot speak their indigenous native languages anymore because they were so violently subjugated that culture was robbed. They were robbed of it. It was robbed from them. So that's why so many West African nations speak French or English, shit like that. It's a horrible, horrible fucking thing, and so it's no surprise that with that violent subjugation comes the musical influence. That's why they're playing like actual Western violins in India and shit, and that's why they're playing like actual Western guitars in Africa and in it doesn't mean that there weren't instruments like guitars and like violins in India and Africa. There certainly were. Europeans do not have the monopoly on the technology to create a stringed instrument, but those particular stringed instruments were imposed on those those communities and, brought there. And along with it was a lot of the musical theory, of constructing a music where you stack thirds on top of each other, thirds and sixths, or harmony rooted in that, triads, seventh chords, etc. And you create a music where you're constantly stacking notes on top of each other to create chords and chord progressions. And not just any chord progressions that have a hierarchy that go subdominant, dominant, tonic. The dominant always has to resolve to the tonic. Tonality, as opposed to modality, which does not have that same hierarchy. Or as opposed to monophonic music, which does not have this constant stacking of notes as being one of the foundational tenets of it. These places did have harmony, just not the same kind of harmony. And the primary focus of the music was not harmony, necessarily. Yeah, you can strum all the open strings of an oud, or like a African stringed instrument. Yeah, you can play two notes at once. You can drone an open string and play a melody on top of it, and that's harmony. But they weren't necessarily stacking 3, 4, 5 notes on top of each other and moving them through a song like that, like Beethoven did, or like Bach was doing when he was composing 8-part invertible counterpoint. That's not what they were doing. So I've digressed a little bit, but to return to my point, thirds-based music is I'm using that term thirds-based. I kind of made that term up, but I think it stands that it is music where the foundational building blocks are not the fifths, not the fourths, but are the thirds. And it's not just that those are the foundational building blocks of the music, it's that one of the primary things in the music is the stacking of notes to create chords. And so you have basically a music that is harmonically super intense, okay? Complete with hierarchies of subdominant, dominant, tonic. So that's what I think of when I think of thirds-based music. Now, does that mean that I think thirds-based music is bad? No, I don't. I don't think a music can be good or bad. I don't even talk in terms of good or bad usually, or moral or immoral. I don't think that. I actually think that Western music and its trajectory is really pretty impressive, as are other things about the West. The industrialization of the West, Britain was the first place to industrialize. That's where the first industrial revolution happened in Western Europe. Industrialization and and the musical development, the cultural development of Western Europe, have to do with technical improvements. So, for example, in order to play chords thoroughly in multiple different keys inside the same song on the same instrument, you have to create new instruments that can do that. You have to create a piano. You have to create a guitar. The only things that can really do that on one instrument are pianos and guitars. In order to be able to put all these thirds relationships into multiple different keys, you have to create a tuning system that makes them equal in all 12 keys. And so that gets me to another point, which is 12-tone equal temperament. So in the West, we didn't always use 12-tone equal temperament, meaning that there are 12 equidistant chromatic steps in the chromatic scale. We use many different kinds of tuning systems, and the natural tuning system is the tuning system of the overtone series, which is what we call justified intonation or just intonation. And in just intonation, you have the octave is the first interval you get, but it only reproduces the same pitch, double the frequency. Then you get a fifth. It's the second one. The second interval is the fifth. Remember that. And then you get the fourth, which is the inversion of the fifth. So you don't get a new note. And then you get a third, but that third in the overtone series is flat. It's more mellow compared to our 12-tone equal tempered third that we use on pianos and guitars, and the way we tune an orchestra, because it's slightly flat. We've sharpened those thirds so that we can make them equal in all 12 keys. That is something that what it was is actually a sacrifice of the equal. I'm sorry, not the equal, but it was a sacrifice of the natural tuning of the third. So you're actually kind of sacrificing nature in order to be able to play these intervals, and the third interval in particular, in all 12 keys. And so there's a give and a take there. Like, yes, there's this super impressive ability to stack all these notes on top of each other and play this harmonically dense, rich music, utilizing an interval that's higher up in the overtone series, which is the third, which is a more dissonant interval from the fifth. Yes, there's something impressive about the richness of that and the ability to do that and the technological advancements necessary to be able to achieve that. But you also sacrificed something in order to do that. There's a contradiction there. So that's important to remember. Now, again, I'm not an expert in the history of Western classical music, but I know enough about it to be able to talk about it. And I can say that, I don't want to talk about a form of music as though it is bad or incorrect. I don't believe that. I love that music. I love Bach. I love Beethoven, etc. I love the 20th century classical composers especially. But what is bad, and when I say bad, I don't mean morally bad, although I do think it's morally bad, but let's leave morals out of the picture for a second. When a place like Western Europe violently imposes its economic will and political will and cultural will on other places like Africa, the Middle East, Latin America, Asia, when a power does that, violently imposes its will, it is something that disrupts and stagnates those places in a way that makes for a more unstable world. I'm going to use the word it's unstable and it's irrational to do that. It creates a very irrational, unequal, unnatural situation for everybody. So when I say it's bad, yes, it's morally reprehensible. But if we leave that out for a minute, because people tend to get weird when you talk about morals, and I don't even think making moral arguments is a strong argument. But if you make an economic argument that now, to this day, Africa and Latin America and Asia, they have a hard time keeping up with technological progress and and they have a hard time maintaining or even having their own economic and political sovereignty because of the history of colonialism. And I'm talking about Western colonialism in particular. I got a comment, someone was like, all cultures engaged in colonialism at one time or another. Whatever, maybe, sure, I guess, but there's one form of colonialism that we feel the repercussions of to this day, and it's the colonialism of Western Europe. The Ottoman Empire was toppled by the British. The Islamic Empire, the Muslim Empire, also was toppled by the Western powers. You're not making a good argument by saying that. We don't all speak Arabic. We don't all speak Turkish. We don't, in Africa, the dominating cultural, the foreign cultural influence that's going on there is Western. It's not, no, come on. So anyways, this video has already gone on long enough. But here's the argument I really wanted to make. So when Train decided to move away from this, so, by the way, let me talk about jazz for a minute. American jazz is a result of colonialism. It is the process of African Americans who were forcibly brought to the United States from Africa through slavery, through the slave trade. It is the process of them dealing with that colonial Western influence and mixing it with their own blood memory from Africa and mixing it with their own cultural heritage and creating something new. I'm not going to say that white people didn't have any hand in the creation of jazz, but I think it's pretty clear that largely this is an African American music, and that the most defining characteristics of jazz are the fact that it is African people, or an African diasporic people, dealing with colonial influences and producing a new music. But the thing about that music is that in early jazz, and jazz even through the 40s and the 50s, still it maintains that subdominant dominant tonic relationship. It maintains that largely third space relationship. We're still largely dealing with seventh chords, ninth chords. These are stacked thirds relationships. We don't voice them like stacked thirds. Nobody voices them like stacked thirds. Not even Bach did that. Not even Beethoven did that. But it's still, we're still dealing with major, minor, dominant, minor 7 flat 5, etc. Right? Like, so the African influence already began to warp that harmonic thing from the beginning. The rhythmic content completely changes the harmonic game. So you're using our harmonic anticipations. You're playing notes early before chords, notes that are supposed to fit chords that come later, and you play them early so they're wrong on the chord that you're on, wrong in Western terms. So you get these dissonances coming from the rhythm. Also, the swing rhythm allows you this harmonic flexibility. There's a quote. It's not a real quote. Maybe it's a quote, but it's something that jazz players say all the time. It's like, you can play anything as long as it swings. And that's true. You can play the weirdest, wildest shit if the time is good, So that is already stretching the European thing. Another thing that stretches it is the African modal influence over a tonal harmonic bass, over a Western tonal harmonic bass, blues. Okay, so blues is a modal music. The blues scale, or blues phrasing, blues melodic content is modal in nature. It's not tonal. It's not a major scale. It doesn't have leading tones. It's not like that. It's a mode, and I should talk about modes some other time. But when you put modal melodies over top of a tonal thing with subdominants, that's where you get all your sharp nines, your flat 13s from, and your flatted fifths over chord, dominant 7, flat 5, dominant 7, flat 13. That's because you're playing the minor third of the blues scale over the 5 chord. The sharp 9 is you playing the minor third of the blues scale over the 1 dominant. So you're already getting that stretch, but you still have kind of the subliminal, like, Western influence in there. And so when Train and McCoy started playing music based solely in fifths, remember, the lowest interval in the harmonic series that you can possibly play without it being in the octave that just reproduces the same pitch. So that's the fifth. Remember, it goes, harmonic series goes octave and then fifth. So that fifth, when you start making a music bass in the fifth, or its inversion, which is the fourth, that basically kind of completely shed. It was a total break. It was a complete break from the Western harmonic thing. They still had the African rhythm. They still had the blues in there and the modes, but they got rid of that Western third stuff. So that's huge. Like, that's a huge break. That's why everyone after Train, that's not the only reason why. Train has influenced, Train had like 3 periods to his career, and each period was remarkably influential on musicians. But that's why after Train recorded A Love Supreme, there was this massive kind of revolution in jazz. And now everybody, myself included, nobody can call themselves a jazz musician, like a fully formed jazz musician, unless they're playing that unless they can play. They don't have to always play, but can play that fourth bass pentatonic modal stuff. It's just a part of the style. You have to be able to play the modal thing. You have to be able to play the fourth and fifth thing, the chordal harmony. Piano players have to be able to play the McCoy stuff. Saxophone players have to be able to play the pentatonic of Love Supreme stuff. Or else you're not really like fully accessing the tradition if you're not doing that. So this is the final point I wanted to make, is that, so this is rooted, Train's break from Western music was broadly an anti-colonial move, influenced by liberatory thinking, liberatory politics. Now, I don't think that Train necessarily used the word anti-colonial. I don't think he necessarily said out loud, or at least not that I know of, he may have. I don't think he said out loud, I am trying to liberate my people by using the fifth. I don't think he said that. He definitely talked about liberation a lot, but I don't think he made that explicit connection. But what you have to do is you have to make the connections yourself. So I'm going to talk about a couple things. First thing, Train wrote the piece Alabama, which is based on the speech Martin Luther King Jr. gave after the white supremacist terrorist attack in Alabama, where a KKK member lit off a bomb in front of a church in Alabama that killed 4 young black girls. Train listened to MLK's speech, and he went home and he played, and he composed a piece that he said was based off of the speech patterns of MLK's speech. Okay, so if you don't think MLK had some liberatory views and some anti-colonial policies, then learn about MLK. That should be obvious. But here's another thing that I wanted to bring to people's attention. Is Train's relationship to Malcolm X, who it kind of doesn't get much more anti-colonial than Malcolm X. I've got this pulled up here. I'm going to read from it. This is a Train with an interview between Coltrane and someone named Kofsky. Kofsky says, some musicians have said that there's a relationship between, hang on. Let me go back here. I'm going to start here. Kofsky, the first thing I want to ask you about is a story that somebody told me. The first night I came here, the people I was staying with have a friend, a young lady, and she was downtown at one of Malcolm X's speeches. And lo and behold, who should pop in the seat next to her but John Coltrane? Right away, that whetted my curiosity, and I wanted to know how many times you have seen him, what you thought of him, and so forth. Coltrane says, that was the only time. Kofsky, were you impressed by him? Coltrane, definitely. That was the only time. I thought I had to see the man, I was living downtown in NYC. I was in the hotel. I saw the posters, and I realized that he was going to be over there. So I said, well, I'm going over there to see this cat because I had never seen him. I was quite impressed. Kofsky says, were you impressed by him? Train says, definitely. Come on, guys. Train likes Malcolm X. Black nationalist, liberatory, anti-colonial, went to Africa, talked about the liberation of Africa, talked about the liberation of the colonized black folks in America. Train was definitely impressed with Malcolm X. I was quite impressed, Train says. Kofsky, some musicians have said that there's a relationship between, I love this. Some musicians have said that there's a relationship between some of Malcolm's ideas and the music, especially the new music. Do you think there's anything in that? Coltrane, well, I think that music, being an expression of the human heart or of the human being itself, does express just what is happening. I feel it expresses the whole thing, the whole of human experience, and at the particular time that it is being expressed. So he's basically saying, yes, there is a connection between Malcolm's ideas and the new music. Kofsky, another reason I asked you about Malcolm was because I've interviewed a number of musicians, and the consensus seems to be that the younger musicians talk about the political issues and social issues that Malcolm talked about when they're with each other. And some of them say that they try to express this in the music. Do you make a conscious attempt to express these ideas in music? Coltrane, well, I tell you myself, I make a conscious attempt. I want to repeat that. Kofsky asks, do you make a conscious attempt to express these issues in music. He's talking about the ideas, these issues that Malcolm X is addressing. We're talking about systemic racism, colonialism, apartheid, all that stuff. Liberation. Do you make a conscious attempt to express these issues in music? Coltrane says, and I quote, "Well, I tell you for myself, I make a conscious attempt." The answer is yes. I think I can truthfully say that in music, I make or have tried to make a conscious attempt to change what I've found in music. In other words, I've tried to say, quote, "Well, this, I feel, could be better in my opinion, so I will try to do this to make it better." He's saying he's trying to make things better. What things is he talking about? This is what I feel in any situation that we find in our lives. When there's something we could think could be better, we must make an effort to try and make it better. So it's the same socially, musically, politically, and in any department of our lives. Let's repeat that. When there's something we think could be better, we must make an effort to try and make it better. So it's the same socially, musically, politically, and in any department of our lives. So he's literally saying he's trying to use music to make the world a better place based on the ideas of Malcolm X. He's saying that he agrees and is impressed with Malcolm X, and in this conversation about Malcolm X, he's saying that he uses music to try to change what he thinks could be better. And if we're talking about Malcolm X, what are the things that could be better? White racism and white supremacy, the colonization of the third world, the Vietnam War. Listen, most of the musicians I have talked to are very concerned about changing society, and they do see their music as an instrument by which society can be changed. Coltrane, well, I think so. He says he thinks music can change society. I think music is an instrument. It can create the initial thought patterns that can change the thinking of the people. I love that he said the people. Anyways, Kofsky, in particular, here we go. In particular, some of the people have said that jazz is opposed to poverty, to suffering, and to oppression. Therefore, that jazz is opposed to what the United States is doing in Vietnam. Do you have any comments on that subject? Coltrane, in my opinion, I would say that's true, because jazz, if you want to call it that, we'll talk about that later, to me, it is an expression of music, and this music is an expression of higher ideals to me. So therefore, brotherhood is there. And I believe with brotherhood, there would be no poverty. And also with brotherhood, there would be no war. Train's against the Vietnam War, and he's against poverty. Okay, guys? Okay, and then the interviewer goes on to ask things that are unrelated to our topic. What's my point here? Train saw Malcolm X. He liked it. He wanted to use music to change the world. He wanted to use music to change the world based on the ideas of Malcolm X in particular. He wanted to use music to change the world based on the ideas of MLK. He wanted to, not just him, McCoy Tyner would play at Black Panther rallies. Now, if you listen to McCoy talk about that, he's not thrilled about the combination between politics and music, but he still played at those rallies. So we have people that are bumping elbows with some of the most revolutionary thinkers and activists of our time. Malcolm X, the Black Panther Party, Martin Luther King, etc. So why is this important? Why am I talking about this? I got some comments on this that said, this is the funniest part, and I want to end with this. I got some comments from people that said, you know, your video was great, but you shouldn't mix politics and music. Oh, really? Train certainly did. McCoy Tyner certainly did. Many, many others certainly did. So if you really want to play this shit, if you really want to learn about these ideas that I'm talking about, the circle of fifths, pentatonic scales, using the fifth instead of the third, you want to learn about this stuff, you have to care about these issues. You have to understand where this philosophy and theory comes from. What is its material basis? It's not just some cool idea. I know a lot of you out there just want to play some hip sounding shit, and you just want to play some cool shit. Maybe you're just a shred metal guitar player that doesn't know anything about jazz, and you listen to some fourths and some fifths, and you're like, oh, that sounds like a sci-fi movie. I want to do that. Boop, boop, beep, boop, beep, boop, boop. No. Like, you can start there, and that's fine. And but if you really want to get the importance and the significance and the weight of this, you have to understand its historical and material basis. Liberation for colonized people, liberation for black people in the United States, liberation from poverty, liberation from imperialism. That is the basis of this. And if you think that's stupid, pick a different idea, pick a different musical idea to work on, man, because that is the basis of this. If you think that's stupid, don't play jazz. That is integral to the DNA of jazz since the beginning. Read a book, read about Train, read about McCoy, read Malcolm X's autobiography, where he talks about knowing all the Duke Ellington, Count Basie. He knew all those cats. Read about the Black Panther Party, read about, it's just silly to me that anyone would think that you can separate these things, that you can play the Coltrane ideas and language and not know about this stuff and not think that it has some sort of importance. You don't necessarily have to agree 100%. But just know that if you're playing this stuff